Namaste. In this week we are looking at the measurements of tree diameters. In the last class we looked at the cross section of a tree and we looked at its bark. How do we calculate the thickness of a bark, how do we calculate the bark volume and the bark percentage. In this class we shall look at how to measure the diameter. So, what is the point? Well, we know that diameter varies with height from the base. So, we know that our trees have a taper. So, if we measured the diameter at this location, say D1, at this location D2, this location D3 and so on, we would have that D1 is greater than D2 is greater than D3 is greater than D4 is greater than so on, and this is because of the taper of the tree. So, if we know that our trees taper, we need to find out a standard at which we are going to measure the diameter, so that the diameter that you measure and the diameter that I measure for the same tree should remain the same. So, what is that standard? That standard is called the DBH, or the diameter at breast height. So, diameter at breast height means that if we had a tree and if a person stood in front of the tree, it would be a diameter that is very close to the height of his or her chest, so that the measurement of the diameter is easy. So, this DBH is chosen for ease of measurement. However, even if we chose this DBH, its meaning would be different in different countries. So, for instance, DBH is 1.3 meters or 1.37 meters or 1.2 meters depending on which country you are in. For instance, Japan and Korea take the value of 1.2 meters. Our country takes the value of 1.37 meters as the breast height. Most of the countries in the world take the measure of 1.3 meters, and US, it is still using the FPS system, it takes 4.5 feet as DBH. Now, the International Union of Forestry Research Organizations, or the IUFRO, International Union of Forestry Research Organizations, it recommends that we use the term D in place of DBH. However, in our course we will be using D or DBH interchangeably because they mean the same thing. When we use this term D, we define two things, DOB and DUB. As we saw in the previous slide, this is the diameter over bark and this is the diameter under bark. So, not only do we need to tell at what height are we measuring our DBH, we also need to tell whether we are measuring the DOB or the DUB. So, as we saw in the previous lectures, DUB and DOB are related. So, if this is your DUB and this is your DOB and this is your bark thickness T, then the relationship is DOB is equal to DUB plus twice the thickness, or the bark thickness is half of DOB minus DUB. So, now we can say that for any tree we are going to measure its diameter at the breast height. But what would you do if this tree were standing on a sloping ground? So, this is for a straight ground. Suppose this tree were standing on a sloping ground like this. If this were your tree, Now, how do you calculate your 1.37 meters? Is it this 1.37 meters or is it this 1.37 meters? So, because if you measure it at this point, you would have a greater diameter, and at this point you would be having a lesser diameter. Now, to solve such problems, we have some formal rules. So, in the case of slope, we would only be taking the upper slope diameters. So, you would be measuring it here. Similarly, if your tree had a bulge in between, now this bulge could be an irregular stem cross section. You could be having a branch that is protruding, or you could be having a bulge that is caused by some insects. So, in such cases, and suppose your 1.37 meters comes here. Now, this would not be your representative diameter at breast height. So, what would you do? You would measure a diameter right below your bulge and you would measure a diameter right above your bulge. So, suppose this one was your D1, this one was your D2. So, you would write D is equal to the average of D1 and D2, so that it becomes the most representative diameter at breast height. Now, if you had a tree that was sloping, suppose your ground is straight but your tree is sloping. So, how do you measure your dBH? Do you measure it from this point? So, is it this 1.37 meters? Or is it this 1.37 meters? Or it is a central portion of 1.37 meters? So, here the rules state that you take measurements at the right angle to the tree axis. So, in this case our tree axis is this. So, we need to take measurements at right angle to this. So, we take 1.37 meters here and we take the right angle, and this becomes our dBH or small d. So, if you can look at this slide, here we are seeing a tree that is sloping on a flat ground. So, this is what we were referring to. Now, suppose your tree had a big buttress. Now, what is a buttress? A buttress means that in some areas you have the roots that are extremely protruding. So, this is your ground level and here you have very thick roots. So, because these roots are extremely protruding, so this diameter it becomes very large. So, if suppose this was your 1.37 meters. So, in the case of a buttress, how do you measure it? So, here the rules state that if you have a tree with a buttress, you take your dBH at some point above the buttress at which the diameters have become nearly equal. So, where your buttress is gone. So, here you will measure your diameter at this point. So, here in this slide we can see a tree with a huge buttress. It was found in Andamans. So, now you understand what a buttress is. So, here this buttress is giving it support. Now, another rule tells us what to do in the case of forking. So, as we saw in a previous slide, forking means that if you have a tree and its main stem bifurcated into two parts to give you these two forks. So, this is your fork 1 and this is your fork 2. So, in this case, how do we measure the DBH? So, the rules state that suppose in the first situation this forking occurred above your 1.37 meters. So, suppose this was your 1.37 meters and the forking has occurred above this point. So, in this case you will consider this as one tree and you will measure the DBH at this point. But suppose your 1.37 meters came at this height. Suppose this is 1.37 meters. So, in this case you will consider both these trees as two different trees. So, this is your first tree, this is your second tree. You will not consider this as one tree, and now you will measure your DBH perpendicular to the tree axis. So, this would be your DBH for the first tree and this would be your DBH for the second tree. So, this is D1 and D2. So, now let us look at some examples on these slides. Here you are seeing a forest guard standing right next to a tree. On the left side you can see that the forking has occurred above the breast height. So, the breast height could be taken as the chest height of the forest guard. So, as you can see the forking has occurred above the breast height. So, in this case we will consider this tree as one tree. In the right picture we can see that the forking has occurred below the breast height. So, in this case we will consider it as two different trees. However, the next question is, where do we have the base? So, when we draw a tree, we take a base. So, in this case we are taking a base. Now, we take this base as the ground level. However, can we uniquely define this base? What if this base was not as a straight line, but it was something like this? Then what would be the base? Now, here the rules are a bit ambiguous. We do not have a proper definition of the base. The base could be an average derived from measurements at different points around the tree. So, basically if you took this, if you measured these heights for your base, you could draw an average. So, the average would be somewhere here, in which case you will take that as the base. Otherwise, what you could do is you could use the root collar. Now, what is a root collar? So, if we drew any stem, so here you have a main stem, you have branches and leaves, and then you have the roots. Now, this point where the root system and the shoot system meet together is called the collar. So, we could even disregard the ground level and we could take this collar as the base. So, that is the second definition of base. The base of the tree is synonymous with its root collar. So, we can figure out the root collar because the cross sections of the stem are very different from the cross sections of the root. So, they are completely different tissues. So, it is easy to identify the collar. We could take that collar as the base, or we could take the measuring position on the uphill side. So, that is, we had this tree and suppose the ground level was something like this. So, we could take on the uphill side the measuring position. So, this could be taken as the base. We could then draw an axis of the tree, then draw a line that is perpendicular to the axis and going through this point. So, this is 90 degrees, and we could define this to be the base. So, that is another definition of base. or otherwise when you chop a tree, you could take any position that is 4.15 centimeters below your stump as the base. So, suppose you have a stump that is left. So, a stump is generally 1 feet or 1 foot, but then we do some stump dressing. So, we could take any point that is 4.15 centimeters below the top of the stump, and we could define that as the base. So, that is another definition of base. So, as we can see, there are different definitions of base, and base is something that has not been uniquely defined by the IUFRO. So, there is one point where we could have some ambiguity, but in any case, in the case of forestry, our measurements considering considering one tree that is say around 20 meters or 30 meters in height, a small difference in the calculation of the base is not going to bring about a substantial difference in our computed values, which is why this definition of base has not been gone into very great depths, but the other rules are quite well clear. Thank you for your attention. Jai Hind.